Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who's joining us, and welcome to this first session of our 2023 CRADLE International Symposium on reorienting authentic assessment for an unknown future. My name is Rola Jawi. I'm a professor of education research at CRADLE. It seems I'm also color coordinating, which, I didn't realize until I sat down in front of the slides, but there you go. I must have been working subliminally. I would like to start, though, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which Deakin students, staff, and communities come together and as we learn through virtually and physically constructed places across time. I pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, Eastern Ma country, and Wurundjeri country, where Deakin physical campuses are located, and acknowledge the many First Nations from where students join us online and make vital contributions to our learning communities, and from where you might be joining us. Please feel free to use the chat to indicate country. This is a really important time for us, and especially with the referendum this weekend. So I really do pay my respects and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It's my great pleasure today to be chairing this session. As I mentioned, this is the first in 3 sessions for our international symposium. CRADLE hosts an international symposium every year, and this year we're looking at authentic assessment, especially in a time where assessment is really challenged by a number of things, whether it's artificial intelligence or cheating and academic integrity, or issues of equity. And so it's really timely, I think, to be looking at assessment and what authentic assessment is. And we're starting with this keynote presentation by Professor Crina Damşa. And I'd like to introduce Professor Damşa, who's a professor in the Department of Education, Faculty of Educational Sciences at the University of Oslo in Norway, where she's Vice Dean for Innovation and Digitalization. Her research has really strongly theoretically informed sociocultural and looks at technical aspects of learning in diverse contexts, but primarily in the context of graduate, undergraduate education and professional learning. And Crina's title today is Assessment in the Wild, Understanding Collaborative Learning and the Need for Authentic Assessment, and really troubling complexity in collaborative learning. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and welcome you, Crina, with a big round of virtual applause. So welcome, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this very kind introduction and for the invitation to the CRADLE International Symposium. I'm looking forward to engaging and inspiring conversations in the upcoming days. I will try to share my screen. And we'll try to also use a pointer here. And I appreciate if you could let me know if you can see my screen in presentation mode.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that confirmation. Perhaps a brief warning before starting. I'm using a lot of visualizations in my presentation, also to compensate for the fact that the presentation is online, but also perhaps for the various accents that I'm accumulated throughout years: Romanian, Norwegian, let's say European English accent. I hope, thank you for understanding. My presentation today will focus on a topic that has triggered my research interest over the past decade: collaborative learning. More concretely, I will discuss the value of an ecological framework for examining collaborative learning and a number of empirical illustrations, which are based on my concluded and ongoing research on small group collaboration in graduate education. I invite you to reflect together with me, both on the conceptual elaboration I'm proposing and the way this elaboration can serve the efforts towards a more authentic approach to assessing collaborative learning. Yes, I'll proceed. So clearly, this was a dramatized example of a high-fidelity collaboration situation in a specialized medical context. What I observed in this particular example is the doctor identifying a medical problem threatening the patient's life, sharing of medical information and use of medical instruments, coordination of tasks, and much more. So while this type of collaboration is in a specific context, we know that elements of collaboration appearing in these examples are generic and present in other disciplines and professions. So while collaborative learning is often seen as a pedagogical application at a micro level in the classroom, it is salient to our work, learning, and daily activities and contexts. Collaboration and collaborative learning are always connected to a context, geographic, social, cultural, disciplinary. And exactly for this reason, collaborative situation holds tremendous potential for learning. It is not only the learning of collaborative skills, how to collaborate, but also a new knowledge and critical work with knowledge, ways of acting and ways of being. Collaborative learning is common at all education levels, as we well know, and takes many forms: small group work, collaborative tasks, or joint inquiry and discovery. What I have learned from existing research and my own explorations is that collaborative learning is complex, dynamic, and often messy, and that we have not yet succeeded in understanding its complexity. For example, are we fully able to account for the way a group of students, as you see in this image, reason together around a task, use online resources, write up ideas on a laptop, coordinate their work? In other words, whether their interaction is productive, what they have learned from it, how assessment of this collaboration task should be shaped or to capture their learning over time, and not only the correctness of the output. So examining the output of collaborative learning has been proven valuable, but insufficient. So this is especially when we want to understand how learning opportunities are materialized during a period of a task, a project, or an entire course. How individuals contribute to interaction, and disciplinary and physical and digital and cultural resources are blended into a collaborative learning activity. To be able to address such challenges in educational practice surrounding the assessment of collaborative learning, we need to understand this complexity and how this looks like in what we coin as authentic learning environments and contexts, to which I will return later. In my research, I take up this exploration, and I suggest that an ecological perspective of collaborative processes offer a toolkit for better understanding collaborative learning, which can enable constructive approaches to learning design and constructive assessments. So in the following minutes, I will discuss and propose and discuss a conceptual framework based on an ecological perspective of collaborative learning. This is perhaps a more theoretical discussion. In addition, I will discuss a number of empirical examples which illustrate how I, myself, and my collaborators attempted to unpack these complexities, as I wish to subject this to your critical reflection and feedback at the end of this talk. And finally, I will reflect on how these research explorations, framework, and approaches could possibly serve efforts directed at design for learning and constructive assessment of collaborative learning. I am proposing an ecosystem metaphor as a way to account for the complex, dynamic, and situated nature of collaborative learning, and an ecological perspective on collaboration as a framework for interpretation. In environmental sciences, ecology is defined as the study of the relationships between living organisms and their environments as they interact within their ecosystem. Ecosystems have two defining characteristics. First, they are multi-layered and composed of organisms and populations, each within specific traits developed through their life history. The simplest example, an ecosystem of a lake, with all life forms living there together, but also their evolution history. Second, dynamic interactions between organisms sustain those ecosystems. Such developments are inseparable from the development of its individual elements and are influenced by their relationships. Life forms in a lake interact, and changes in one leads to changes in the ecosystem. Learning systems have many similar features to environmental systems. They are multi-layered, from microprocesses at the level of the individual cognition or motivational traits, to a collective level of learning communities, disciplines, or educational institutions, as they are characterized by dynamic relationships between interacting elements within and across these layers. A group of students collaborating are part of a school context where a curriculum is taught, particular teaching methods are being used, and other student groups are engaging in the same type of work. But the students have also their own social lives, interests, family contexts, various expectations and motivations for collaborating, as well as varying prior knowledge and collaborative skills. There are several ecological theories that I draw upon that are used to describe human development and learning by describing the constitutive elements of and how they function. These descriptions place the emphasis either on the person, on relations, or on communities. The person-focused ecological models, such as Bronfenbrenner's depicted here, place the entire focus on individual cognitive activities, but not in isolation from their environments. Contemporary theories of distributed cognition highlight how higher-level cognitive processes, such as thinking or problem-solving, are intertwined with material surroundings. These perspectives justify studying patterns of interaction between mental activities, embodied actions, and the resources in the environment. The relation-focused models have resemblance with social, material, and cultural historical approaches to learning, connecting back to Vygotsky's sociocultural psychology. The focus is on how tools and signs, language, representation, objects, mediate interactions between learners and help them in their collective meaning-making processes or understanding. Finally, community-focused models emphasize the learning of collectives in organizations or in informally emerging communities. Activity systems or networks are examples of frameworks that help explain configurations, functioning, and the environments of larger collectives and how sustained interaction is essential to their existence. In conceptualizing collaborative learning and what may be irregular trajectories and intersection points during collaboration, elements of each of these technological notions blend into one another. Accordingly, cognitive theories that account for individual learners' thinking and reasoning are required, but it's both the theorizing of mental processes and of distributed cognition that fits into an ecological notion of collaboration. Theoretical notions describing how individuals relate to each other and to the environment during collaborative encounters are essential, as collaboration is fundamentally relational. Theories at the level of organization and collective learning may help explain the connection to sets of resources available in broader environments and developed historically. You might wonder how it's even possible to consider studying such a mesh of elements, layers, and trajectories. And it is a justified question. One instrumental notion that can help untangle this complexity is that of unit of analysis. And I claim that a unit of analysis can be seen as a meaningful set of ideas that synthesize the research problem in relation to the phenomenon being studied. In deciding on what the unit of analysis will be, theory is important, but it can also be directive. So to return to the elements that I've been discussing and the models that I've been just elaborating on, I'd like to mention that in a series of studies about the unit of analysis in learning research, together with my collaborator Alfredo Giorni, I argue that the unit of analysis must be adapted to the specific research problem. In an ecological framework, this would always represent an integration of several elements and their relationship. If we briefly now return to the typology of the various ecological models that I mentioned, this provides us with the fundamentals of an ecological unit of analysis. In a person-focused ecological model, the unit of analysis would be still the individual, but individual cognitive processes must expand to include external structures involved in the cognitive activities. Studying how the body and mind are coupled with multiple elements in the environment require focus on different modalities through which the learning activities are taking place. This can be, for example, speech, gestures, manipulation of materials and artifacts, the task, the syllabus, digital platforms, rather than just thinking, reasoning, or isolated emotions. In a relation-focused model, the unit of analysis is at the level of interactional encounters, verbal or non-verbal, between individual learners and the contents, various tools that enable that interaction, or sometimes hinder it. Technology for online connectivity is a very illustrative example. For collaborative learning, the direct interaction mechanisms, talk or non-verbal communication, and the underlying actions that regulate participation and contribution to a task are essential. In a community-focused model, the basic unit of analysis are usually the way networks or communities interact and function, and how they construct the structures and knowledge that eventually becomes used for further learning or individuals, groups, or other collectives. A unit of analysis for researching collaborative learning from an ecological perspective would have to capture not only distinct aspects of collaboration, but also the processes and tools that enable or hinder it in the context in which it happens. In Vygotsky's words, the unit of analysis must designate, I quote, designate a product of an analysis that possesses all the basic characteristics of the whole. Alfredo and I claimed that an ecological unit of analysis must move beyond the individual social dichotomy and account for both the epistemological and ontological dimensions of learning. Individuals come together to work on a joint task. When they do, they bring with them both individual traits, knowledge and skills learned throughout their life history and within their, to use a Husserlian notion, life worlds, which shape both their knowledge and experiences of the world. It is inevitable that these multiple individual layers intersect and interact at cognitive or relational level while attending to a joint task or problem, or timescale that can range from a few minutes in a collaborative task in school, in the classroom context, for example, 2 weeks or month in the case of a collaborative project spanning a longer period of time. Finally, these interactions never take place in a vacuum, but most often in organized context or of a class or a course where pedagogical tools and knowledge artifacts developed historically, such as books, databases, devices, set the premises for the collaborative process. Here you see a summary of all these elements that I and my collaborator claim that constitute a unit of analysis. And one reflection that is important here is, and perhaps a critical reflection, is that this combination of elements that make an ecological unit of analysis can never be present all at the same time in our analysis. So what is actually important here at analytical level and empirical level is how we manage to construct a unit of analysis which we can examine in depth, still doing justice and accounting for the complexity of the phenomenon that we are studying, which might hold all these elements, but which we cannot examine concurrently at the same time. So I will be moving now into discussing or providing some examples of empirical examinations from my previous work and collaborators' work, where we attempt to account for this ecosystemic complexity and the dynamic nature of collaborative learning. And in general, my research in the past 5-7 years has had a relatively unitary focus on how students work in groups and various types of tasks or collaborative projects to create knowledge to solve problems in collaboration. And one aspect that I've been much interested in is our productive interactions in collaborative groups. Another, how objects, tools, or developing artifacts, and I'll provide a few examples in a moment, mediate this interaction, and how experiences collaborative learning and work, how students experience collaborative work and work on shared artifacts. And as you can see, I'm trying here to actually bring to the fore some of the elements of this ecosystem of collaboration as and try to identify them as part of a unit of analysis that it's still integrating all these elements. The empirical contexts that I've been working on in my previous research have been teacher education. Here you see an example from a study where groups of teacher education students have been engaging in projects where they were examining problems in school practice related to assessment. It was in particular in the context of environmental education, where the schools were developing both curriculum and instruments for assessing this type of competence in this particular domain. And students were conducting both inquiries, literature reviews, and then constructing assessment instruments, which they proposed to the respective schools where they conducted their internships. And you can see some example of artifacts that they produced on the right side of the screen. In another empirical context is software engineering education, again, group projects spanning a longer period of time where first-year undergraduate students were working in learning to develop websites using various programming languages. And you see examples of their artifacts, some of the websites produced by the students, again, on the right side of the screen. And then finally, another context I've been conducting this type of research in is media and design education. This was actually in another country in Europe than the one I live in. You see groups of students consisting of actually local and international students coming together to learn to develop digital media libraries. And here you see an example. Again, these are first-year undergraduate students, so they are novices in this area, and they've been both learning to collaborate, so developing collaborative skills, but also actually developing their domain competence and programming skills. I'm showing here as an overview the typical data set that I collected throughout the years to document collaborative dimensions. We always collected interaction data, whether verbal or written, which would be mostly recordings of group meetings, but also written interactions such as online messaging or emails. The artifacts the students produced, both the final artifacts, but also those under development. Self-reports on experiences, either in the form of survey data or semi-structured interviews, and always secondary data that would provide us with some information about the context in which the student groups were working, such as course documents and other data of that kind. So to enter this, the work that we've been putting into identifying such an ecological unit of analysis, one of the analytical categories that helped us capture complexity were that of actions, and we looked at various types of actions, and actions could be both verbal and non-verbal. So in our coding scheme, we apply this to all types of actions, and the types of actions we identify, categories of actions were epistemic, so those where students would engage in discussing or elaborating knowledge. Object-related interactions or artifact-focused interactions, which are targeted towards, and I'll show a few examples, targeted towards developing a particular artifact in collaboration. The regulative actions, usually targeting or aimed at managing the collaborative process, and social relational actions. And this is definitely developed through an abductive approach based on previous research, but also based on our exploration. So we've been back and forth through these categories, analytical categories. And as examples of epistemic actions that I've mentioned, focused towards being oriented on content. Examples are sharing or gaining knowledge, creating shared understanding. But what we found in our research that they never occurred in isolation. And this is a fairly trivial finding by now in the collaborative research domain field, that talk on task definitely is combined or intertwined with activities that are aimed at managing collaboration. And here you see a few examples, and the list is obviously not complete. I'm showing just illustrations. At the same time, we've been identifying or trying to identify how talk on tasks or talk that is aimed at solving problems actually is generative of content for and development of these shared artifacts that I've been referring to. So generative collaborative actions are important in that they feed the development of a shared artifact. And this analytical category of object-related interaction or oriented interactions is well illustrated by actions in which ideas are taken up from the discussion into and processed into certain artifacts. So here is an example where how we identified or how we are visualizing how concepts were being taken up from different phases of a project throughout the whole project period. So we see in the first rectangle, how initial set of concepts was put forward, and it was discussed throughout the period of the project period, and it was adjusted and developed, further elaborated throughout in the final artifact. I'm going very fast through this, but I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Here we see another type of artifact that is being mediated, a collaboration. So here we see how resources in the form of various objects are intertwined or entangled in the verbal interaction, and not only verbal interaction of the group. We see technical objects that represent the infrastructure for the students' activities. We see boundary objects. This is an example of a digital database for professional programmers that the students in a software programming case have used to inform themselves about the knowledge in the field in order to integrate it in their own learning activities, programming activities. And then we see also the websites that they've been developing, which functioned as an epistemic object in that this was the focus of their interaction, of their work. This is what was guiding their discussions, and this was also, in the end, the output of their work. So in terms of assessing this both interaction and group work, what we observed in our studies is that the focus is always on the group products and less on the processes that were led to the development of these products. And together with the teachers, in the teacher education case, for example, we developed an assessment scheme that looked at not only at the quality of the final product, but also at the way the content, which in this case it was written textual reports on assessment instruments, the complexity of and the elaboration of the content. So in a sense, that takes into account both the final product and the quality of the final product, but also looks into how the ideas and the concepts that I just mentioned before were taken up and elaborated, and to which level of complexity. And you can see here we've used 4 levels of complexity that try to map the way in which these ideas and concepts and the content was elaborated. What I would like to just briefly illustrate, in addition to interaction and the role of objects in interaction, so some elements of this ecology, is the relational aspect of collaboration. And this is obviously a vast field, but the way we've looked at is trying to identify both how, for example, affect and emotions are playing a part in the students' micro-level collaboration, but also how students capitalized on, or groups capitalized on, broader sets of resources or broader networks of thinking of the community level, expanded to that level, in order to gain knowledge for the particular task or problem they were working on. And this is an example from the media engineering case, where we found something very interesting. We have here, I'm showing here group 1, which is one of the groups we followed, which was working on their own task. The students had the same task description. And they were expected, according to the course description and the teacher's plan, that the students were capitalized on regular resources, the curriculum, and on teachers' expertise and knowledge, and also perhaps on knowledge and support from the other groups. This was a small course. Students knew each other. They were collaborating often. But what happened here and what we found is that actually this group, as an illustration, reached out beyond the course and the institution boundaries to the ethnic community. These were international students, so they connected to the ethnic community in their respective city and collected ideas, knowledge, and actually got guidance from experts from that ethnic community. So we see here an expansion of what we intended to be our unit of analysis beyond the institution, even not only the course, but also the institutional boundaries, which brings the group work almost into at a community level, if I may say so. So I think I will, considering the time, I will skip this slide. What I would want to show here is like basically bring together all these elements that I've been discussing and showing how we try to create an integrated interpretation of what we've seen in terms of interaction, in terms of resources, mediating resources, but also the trajectory in time. So we've been looking at interaction in terms of key moments where we identified ideas or concepts being put forward and how those were carried forward in subsequent conversations in the group, but also how those ideas were taken up into a certain actions, either written or verbal, into an object iteration. And this would perhaps basically continue in different phases. And from this perspective, we coined a combination of interactional moment, verbal interaction moment, with an action and with a materialization of the content from that coming out from that interaction as a productive interaction. And what we are basically the idea that I'm suggesting here, or I'm proposing, is that when assessing collaboration, especially this type of collaborative work, paying attention to both the interactional processes, but also the actions that follow from those processes, and also the progress and development of in this particular case, objects that are being developed through that interaction is very important, as we risk to miss out on complexities and actually learning elements if we ignore this. I'm rushing a little towards the examples from my current research, and I would very much like to show an example from a large research project called TeamLearn. It's a research project funded by the Norwegian Research Council of Norway, where we looked at teamwork using or attempting, we're actually exploring multimodal analytics in higher education combined with the qualitative approaches that we have used so far. And we are exploring 3 empirical contexts: legal education, medical education, and nursing education. And the aims of the project is to examine collaborative problem solving, also with the use of multimodal analytics, which provide us with different types of data than the ones that we've been working before, and in a more systematic way, and how we can use that data to support data-driven reflection. So basically, and I will be showing an example, showing how data can provide a more sort of objective and systematic overview of groups' work, both for students and for teachers, in order to support a more in-depth reflection. I have here an example, and I think I will use the time to show this example in where you see a group of students in an intensive care simulation lab. And I'll return to discussing this in a minute. So I am stopping the recording here because I will not go into an in-depth analysis of this clip. There is a lot of rich insights we can gain from this, but what I would like to do is to look into the research design and how we engage with both examining collaborative learning in this particular situation, but also how we use this particular opportunity to engage in designing together with the teachers and improving the learning design, but also improving what could lead to better assessment of the situation. So here you see it's a regular, perhaps, setup for a simulation in an intensive or in nursing education and in nursing situations, where we have briefing, a simulation, a debriefing, and a second simulation, and then a second debriefing. Where we enter is we collect data on trying to map stress indications for the students, the patients or the mannequins log, and also group interviews. And thinking back to the complexity and the ecological unit of analysis that we're trying to basically achieve also in this work, we have we collect data on talk on task, information sharing. The nurses are talking about losing consciousness, task coordination, right? So regulative actions, but we also see embodied action, handling the patient, using the technology as a resource and a source of information. We have prosodics from the audio that can indicate both the level or the pace of activity, but also possibly stress. And then we also see use of analog technology like medical instruments. So this is an example of how we engage with the data, which we just started analyzing. And now I'm moving on to the next example from the other empirical context, which is legal education, which is a completely different approach and design. This is work that is happening online or hybrid. So we have groups here in this image. You see groups working face to face, but we also have group working solely online. They use Microsoft Teams as a digital workspace. That is part of the research design because we intend to collect digital traces, and they work over a period of 12 weeks. So these are group projects where students analyze a legal problem and work on development of a digital solution. And I could give the example of this particular group, which was working on understanding and designing a calculator for a fine for corporations, or in case they don't meet certain requirements related to data privacy. And here you have an example of a group working online. The data that we collect here, and I'm insisting on the type of data because we think it is important that we account for the complexity by collecting or gathering a solid and valid data set that gives us insight into that various elements of collaboration. We have video recordings, digital traces of activities in teams, which are logs of participation and contributions. Also the shared artifacts the students produce, both in teams, but also the final product that could be actually a digital tool. And then the self-reflection on progress and group work. So again, a very rich data set. And now I'm moving into the final part of my talk, where without going into the details of how we analyze this data, which is an ongoing challenge, I want to reflect a little on how this research that I just showed, the ongoing part especially, can serve efforts towards designing and conducting authentic assessment of the collaborative learning that we are observing in these cases. And what I am actually proposing here and advocating for is the use of research-based approaches also for actually impacting practice. And in this case, is practiced at a micro level in these particular courses. And to remind you, in case you're not familiar with this approach, this implies a formative interventionist approach where we enter the context, we analyze and explore, which we have been doing. As you could see how we observed and collected data on the processes going on. But then a design and construction phase follows, where we, together with the teachers, if it's a participant, or and the students, if it's a participatory approach, develop certain or redesign the tasks, the context, the design, the assessment forms, in order to support learning or changing practices. And in this case, we are in this particular project in TeamLearn, we're focusing on changing or redesigning learning and assessment designs, but also in designing a digital tool. An iterative iteration follows, where we bring these changes into practice and we collect data on them. And this obviously an evaluation at the end, but these are iterative loops. This type of a process that is described here can happen several times, which can lead to refinement and improvement of the design that is, or the technology that is being brought into the practice. So these are the three cases that I have mentioned, and the examples that I'm showing in the very little time that I have remaining is from nursing and legal education. So we are using, we design for an intervention between simulation in the debriefing, but which is based on the data we collect during the debriefing. So if you recall this, this slide, we collected data during the simulation and we bring it in to support reflection during the debriefing after each simulation. And what we are basically redesigning, and this is not part of the reflection, but this is very salient for teachers' work, is this revised simulation scenario, where certain aspects of the simulation that may require a more focus and attention from the teachers are being basically refined. But then in the reflection session, during the debriefing, what we provide based on the data that we collect is a dashboard for teachers and students that provides data on their interaction. For instance, in nursing, as we well know, one important element is, for instance, closing the loop, which is a communicative act that confirms or supports the nurse's practice in collaborative practice. But also, for instance, information about their stress level. This is something that teachers are very interested in, to check whether students are stressed and whether that affects the way they perform. And then finally, we are working in redesigning a debriefing instrument, and this is also based on observations and the teacher's needs, because the debriefing has been very unstructured, and using the observations that we have from our explorations, we can design a more structured debriefing instrument. In the legal education case, the situation is completely different. We intend to provide data for data-driven reflection on 2 time points during the 12 weeks of the course. And in a first iteration, which has already been performed, we collected data in the first half of the course. We conducted a reflection session with 5 groups of students. And then we followed how students have performed after that. And just to give you perhaps I'll skip this because I know I am actually concerned about the time. So I'll return to this in the Q&A time. In the second iteration, which will happen in the next spring, which will be based on the first iteration, we will organize 2 reflection sessions and collect data in between. And at this point, the students will basically have several moments throughout the course period where they will get information about their interaction, about the progress of their joint work on their shared artifact, and also they will get the opportunity to reflect on how the group work functions for them. In addition to this, and I guess I should have skipped to the next slide, the teachers here are very interested in using this data to basically redesign an assessment instrument that takes into account both the quality of the product, of the output, but also the key moments throughout the course period or the group project period, and how students reflect or engage in collaboration as part of the assessment. So in this particular case, we see a very good example of how we can work together with the teachers to identify and actually make salient the elements of a collaborative ecosystem in the context of this group work that could be assessed by the teachers. So I'm concluding, and the question for me, not being an assessment researcher, but a researcher interested in capturing processes and the complexity of the process and how they lead to a learning outcome, is perhaps not about authentic assessment, but how we can contribute to actually constructing instruments and reasoning towards authentic assessment by using research data and research input. And returning to the analytical representation of the collaborative ecosystem that I'm proposing here, I'm proposing only actions, but of course, some of these actions have been mapped in my previous research. We added in the ongoing research, we see the importance of embodied actions, where for instance, the nursing students are actually manipulating both the patient and instruments. But also many of these actions can be digital, so the digital comes into the picture, and it needs to be taken into account also when considering authentic assessment. What is important in physical face-to-face collaboration, but what might be important in digital contexts might be different things. We have the knowledge and the knowledge domains, we have the relations and how all these elements interact with each other or are in close relationship. We have the objects, resources, and so on. So this is a reminder of this complexity. And my final proposition here is that we can use the theory, and we should use the theory to engage in reasoning about collaboration in this particular case and collaborative learning, and trying to understand it as an ecosystem. I think theory, in the way I propose it here, but of course in many other ways, provide us with a basis for understanding, for instance, collaborative learning as a process constitutive of people, actions, resources, and their relationships over time, but also how this is complex, how it's dynamic, and how it's situated. And then also I claim that we do not capitalize sufficiently on the research methods and methodologies that can help us, for example, using the reasoning around framing a unit of analysis, a unit of observation and of analysis, how that can help us in assisting assessment decisions, and how we as researchers also perhaps can assist teachers in doing so. Perhaps we, in the way I provide an example here, using research design inspired approaches to actually introduce changes in the educational practice together with the teachers, and also using data supported practices that are, as we have already learned, and all this is developing at a fast pace, data holds a lot of potential in informing both decisions regarding learning design, but also assessment design. And I will not close with a conclusion. I am closing with what I see both at the same time opportunities and challenges. And I guess I will leave the screen on for further discussion. And I identify opportunities and challenges related to the research design we use and the unit of analysis that we need to be able to frame, identify, but also work with. Pedagogical opportunities and at the same time challenges, how to use adaptive learning designs and forms of assessment based on the knowledge that we have about, in this particular case, collaborative learning, but also institutional challenges that can have absolutely a supporting but also a hindering role if not in place for different ways of conducting assessment, which is highly necessary in the current context. I thank you for your attention. I have a set of acknowledgements to make to my research team, but also former and current collaborators. And perhaps I'll stop, go out of presentation mode and switch to the previous screen.
Thank you so much, Crina. And as you can see, there's been a lot of chat and there's loads of questions in the Q&A and lots of food for thought really in trying to transfer some of the insights that you've gained from looking at collaborative learning into, you know, what sorts of things might we look for in assessment around the unit of analysis, for example, around thinking through process and outputs, but also I was fascinated by the notion of iteration and the real need for iteration in this work. Before I start with the first question, just a quick heads up to people online. I'll do a formal wrap up in about at the hour. And but then as per usual, we'll stay on for another half an hour to get through the questions. So you can leave at 12 or, you know, stay with us till 12:30 and we'll work our way through the questions. And there's lots of claps and thank yous coming through, Crina, in the chat. So I'll start with the most upvoted question with 13 upvotes from Dave. And he asks, a fundamental dilemma in assessment is that individuals are assessed and this often acts to inhibit. So it's about when we assess, we think about individuals rather than relational and units of analysis that are broader. And the individual focus also cuts across an ecological view. What is your take on resolving this dilemma?
This is obviously a thorny question, and I think Dave knows that. Thank you for the question. I believe that the way we, at least if I take a departure point in the way we research this collaborative phenomenon, the findings, or well, both the explorations and the findings show us that there are ways of structuring assessment towards individual contributions, but also towards joint contributions. And this is exactly what we've been, I haven't really gone into depth during this talk, we've been trying to identify in our examination of the joint problem space, for example. How do, for instance, individual ideas put forward during a conversation lead to either those ideas being dropped, one of that idea, for example, being accepted and pursued and further elaborated, or some of those ideas being merged into a shared idea, which is being further developed and elaborated. And at the point where I talked about levels of complexity of the final product, this is exactly what we've been after, trying to see how an idea that was identified in early stage in a particular textual artifact groups were working on has been further elaborated into something joint. And in addition, the analytics, while is definitely not my favorite methods of research reports or technique, actually gives us the possibility to map, to track a concept put forward in a discussion all the way throughout the collaborative project period, over a period of weeks or months even, because this can be done automatically, digitally, and we can have actually an aggregated overview. And I'm sort of ranting a little here, rambling, but I think this can be a basis for considering how to assess individuals and groups, in that it could be assessment at epistemic level in terms of what content is being put forward by the students, which could indicate also their level of knowledge, but also how that knowledge is being combined by the group. And I think following that is why process measures are important, because in this way we can see what comes in and what throughout the project period is filtered out or forgotten or further developed, which could be indicative of a particular learning process, and eventually when compared with the output, the final output, also of a learning outcome and how that outcome came about. But I would not argue that I have a solution to this. This is more of a reflection based on the research and the findings that we've had so far throughout the years.
But it is, I mean, really interesting to reflect on how the availability of data now allows for a lot more pixelation of what individual students are contributing to the final product, and might actually allow perhaps that maybe address one of those perennial problems around really uneven contribution within any which project, which at the moment is solved by students assessing each other, but then that distorts a heap of other things versus looking at the actual contribution that goes into a project. So that's really interesting, I think. On a really practical level, and I think related to what you're saying, we've got a lot of questions around student resistance to collaborative work. I mean, I presume because your work is research that these students have had to consent, and so there's a level of consent and desire to be there. Have you experienced any resistance to collaborative work, and do you have any suggestions around that for group work projects?
Well, interestingly enough, we haven't. But this is the result of very careful preparations and very carefully approaching the target group, not by just dropping, information about our project and then collecting data and disappearing, but actually being present in the course meetings prior to starting to recruit students, having a lot of discussions with the teachers, and trying to identify prior to approaching students what is important for the students, and then reading a lot of research literature, obviously, that focuses on this. In order to, at the moment when we approach the students directly, we can explain them both what the research project is about, but also how this can benefit them, and also subsequent cohorts of students coming after them, in terms of their learning to learn, in terms of their learning process, and how it could even benefit the learning outcomes on longer term. We are very concerned about ensuring person's privacy, so that is absolutely not an issue. We have done everything by the book, and we have all the ethical approvals, but exactly that aspect of how to make our participants aware that we are doing our research according to all the ethical norms, but also we are thinking of them as participants in this construction, not only about our research data and the quality of our data and our research papers, is actually has contributed to us not having problems with recruitment, and actually very little to no attrition in these research projects.
Which is amazing given how longitudinal they are for some of the projects. We'll pause there for really quickly, because I do have a follow-up question, but I just wanted to give a really quick plug for anyone who's leaving us now. The second in our series of 3 for this international symposium is an open panel on Monday at 3 p.m. And we're really looking at the strengthening of relationships between authenticity assessment and future practice. You should have received the invite for this alongside the invite for this one. So hopefully you know all about this. So please do join us. I think we've got really good panel on board. So thank you to those who've joined us and are leaving us now. But yes, the recording will be available, and we'll try and send that out before Monday if you wanted to have a look at it and ahead of the panel. But just going back to what you were saying there, Crina, about you haven't experienced any resistance. And I can see the parallels with assessment around assessment literacy and being really clear with students about what the purpose is and what you expect their engagement to be, and what that does in terms of, you know, their privacy surveillance, what the data is being used for. I wonder if you can reflect on the context of assessment briefly. And there was a comment about grades and how perhaps grades, what purpose are grades serving in assessment, given this complexity that we've got at the moment?
Again, I guess I need to emphasize that I'm not an assessment researcher, so I'm by far not an expert on this. And I also know that the term that I will be referring to, formative assessment, is perhaps already outdated. But this is something that we've been observing and also considering in our, or taking including into our conversations with the teachers. When first pitching the project for them, and then in our meetings with the teachers about the learning design and the way they see these reflection sessions. For instance, in the nursing cases, I am to take a concrete example, whether they see them as learning opportunities or as assessment opportunities. And I think that informed very much our preliminary conclusion that the assessment, the final grade in this particular case of the simulation scenario, is less important also for the students. The students have also expressed the need for feedback, for reflection, for dialogical engagement with each other in the debriefing and with the teacher. I mean, it's not just one teacher, it's several teachers. They're all nurses, so they're experts exactly on the area the students are learning at that moment. And in our data, in the interview data that we collected after these simulation sessions and the debriefing, students indicated that being in the situation, engaging in reflection, is actually the most valuable thing they need, because that's what they take into their practice later on, for instance, in simulation scenarios in the hospital a week later, and not the grade. So I understand that this is a very, very particular context, and the situation might vary greatly in other contexts, but I believe that we have to be mindful of students' perspective on this. And while in the legal education context, a grade is very important because that's how students after they graduate will get a good job based on their performance. We also learn also in that case that students have appreciated eventually, in retrospect, the fact that throughout the project period, they could learn how to collaborate, because this is something, for instance, students in law not often learn. They learn the benefits of collaboration. So whether that can be graded, that is definitely something that needs discussion. And I have to say that we are discussing that with the teacher in this particular course who's interested in, could I grade my students on their willingness and ability to collaborate? So I wouldn't say, obviously, again, a very complicated matter.
Yeah, I think we just need to invite you back when all the research is done and we see how where you landed after the iteration. We've got a question, and I'm going to get to the theory and ecological because there's some questions about that. But just staying with the design for the minute, were the students involved in the design of these collaborative learning experiences?
Will you allow me to share my screen very quickly, because I have one huge slide which I chose not to show. But it does show the process, the design, well, the iterational design process in a nursing education case. So you see here on the bottom of the screen the phases of design-based research, analysis, design, intervention, and evaluation. And in the first, in the analysis and exploration phase, you see how we first observed in the fall of 22, and then took the data from this observation. So it was basically exploration of the context. We took it, select some of the data and entered data sessions with the teachers, where we basically explored what is important from the teacher's perspective for the students to learn. And in the following spring, 23, we redesigned some aspects of the simulation scenario. And we are now in the iteration phase, number 1, where we are in the middle of it, actually. We are showing this or processing this data, and we'll be providing it as basis for reflection for the students in a second simulation later on in the fall. So in this particular case for nursing education, we have used students' input through the interviews. So we've interviewed the students at the end of simulation rounds, not in the debriefing. So the debriefing is their learning process. That's something else. But we interview them and ask them for feedback on and ideas on what could be useful and meaningful for them to get in terms of data input to reflect on. So this was a sort of a soft form of participation with the students. But in the case of the legal education, and I will just switch the slide that I haven't shown, we've been more systematic. So we've collected data and we've generated this type of overviews. And we organized interviews with the students and obviously also design sessions with the teachers where we ask them to reflect on this type of data. This is basically some statistics based on their meeting time and contributions or during the meetings. That was face-to-face meetings. But also these are stats from participation in MS Teams, right? So chats, posts, uploads, and contribution to certain artifacts, textual artifacts. And this is, and you don't need to look into the details. This is based on self-reflection. So we ask students to score some aspects of participation. This is, I think it was referred to in chat as students assessing each other's collaboration, but this was more about their own participation in collaboration. And we asked the students to assign value to all of these elements in relation to their prospective learning process. Would such data be useful? And based on their inputs, we are designing now the second iteration.
Yeah. So I can see in a paper we've just had accepted around authentic assessment, we make the argument that we can't simply say that it's authentic because we've designed it as so, but it actually has to be seen to be a product of the engagement of students with the assessment itself. And it sounds like, that notion of iteration by gathering data about students' self-reflections on the collaborative process and their actual engagement with it, that helps you to see their the authenticity in the work as it happens, which then helps you to redesign. So I can see that the student data is helping you to refine the design there. I'm going to ask you one last question about the design before moving into the ecological theory, and that's about granularity. So there's a question by Margaret. In the data-driven reflections, which seem to me to provide some joining of the relational, which is through the debriefing, the epistemic and the material, how does the granularity play out? Who focuses on what matters? So I guess if I'm interpreting this right, how do you stop being overwhelmed by sheer volume of data?
Yes, I think Margaret has hit the spot there. It's about data selection, and that unit of analysis. It's a notion that's I'm still working on it. We're still working on it in our group, and trying to make it more concrete in definitional terms, but also in terms of what we include in it. It's an instrumental tool for trying to select the data that at a certain point in time gives us a sensible enough and complete enough view of the phenomenon at that point in time. So we're trying both to slice the complexity transversally, which types of data give us information about an interactional encounter that is constituted of verbal interaction, of written work connected to those verbal interaction on a textual artifact, some elements of emotion involved in that interaction, but also longitudinally. So how would that interactional encounter, what is the follow-up? What type of data would we need to understand what happened, how that would happen in that particular interactional encounter is followed by a reaction or a generative action of the group or just of an individual. And if you recall the slide that I showed, where I showed key moments and actions and then follow up into the objects, that was exactly the attempt to capture both transversely a moment of complexity in the interaction and everything that's related to that interaction, but also over time, how several different levels, for instance, the interactional level, the actions level, which could be embodied or otherwise digital, and the way the object that we followed developed over time. And that was qualitative analytical exercise. So we've used qualitative methods. It was an immense amount of work. But now I see the potential, and we already see have some developed concrete techniques, how the analytics are helping us, and the technology generally, and also generative AI already is helping us in making this process much faster, much more systematic, and probably much more productive in a shorter time.
And actually, we've got lots of people on screen who are really interested in the Gen AI and the technological side. And so I might actually throw to that. And there's a question by Simon Buckingham-Chun. The Gen AI-powered emergence of widely available conversational agents could change teamwork. Does your ecological lens cast such agents in important new roles for authentic collaborative learning?
I will give the honest answer first to Simon. We have not looked into that yet. We are at the phase where, and I'm sure that there are others who have made progress on this already, we are at the phase where we explore the potential of generative AI in analyzing the data. So we're actually, my team back home is working on we've been doing that already. We've been transcribing automatically and doing some sort of content analysis automatically using generative AI. But we are looking more into text processing and APIs that we can use in Teams, for instance, MS Teams, that can help us harvest data automatically and at the same time selecting and processing the data, both to speed up the process, but also to have a sort of more systematic approach to it. I'm fully aware of the discussion about generative AI in education and in which way, many possible ways it could impact both learning and teaching. I think I'm a little reserved in answering this question further because I think it's an ongoing conversation that we need to, engage carefully.
And just following up on that, and I don't know if this is more a comment maybe, but will inevitable hybridization mean it's not possible really to distinguish between the collaboration between the human and the tech roles? And you know, maybe that will make it even more, that line blurring will happen even more into the future. There's a question around, so if we move into the ecology and the ecological perspectives on learning, do you have I guess for people who are starting new, thinking about ecological perspectives of learning, do you have recommended reading to help them get started? And don't, you know, we could send around some references, or if you wanted to answer that now, that would be great.
While talking to you, I've been actually Googling the title of a book, and I think I saw Lina Markauskaite's name in the chat. I just posted a link here. This is not a book about an ecological perspective, but it's a book about ritualizing learning and research methods and using, featuring different theoretical perspectives. One of the chapters led by Lina and written with Lucila Carvalho and myself is actually focusing on ecological perspectives on learning. So I recommend that chapter for sure. The book has been published in September. I can send a collection of readings, or at least titles, that point towards all these theoretical models that I've indicated, from the context of distributed cognition, but also from the sociology. I think they're very useful as background readings, because in that way we can understand how certain elements from these models apply to an ecological perspectives on learning. And finally, I guess there are a few articles that try to make this, they're courageous enough to make this, try to frame an ecological framework that could be used for interpretation. I wouldn't say that they're all very convincing. And here I'm also making a comment or a critical self-reflection point. This framework that I'm proposing and this ecological perspective is a metaphor. The ecosystem I'm using as a metaphor, and I'm not proposing a theory of everything, that's for sure. But I see how certain elements from different theories and theoretical models could be instrumental in actually capturing, to a better extent and to a more the complexity of, in this case, collaborative learning, but this could apply to learning as well. And just to give a simple example, if we think of sociocultural theories and notions, they are very instrumental and very helpful in depicting interaction and interaction with objects and mediation aspects, but perhaps are less useful when trying to understand broader systems in which learning is placed, or the way, for instance, human actions, which interaction are entangled with objects, with resources, with infrastructures. So there I see, for instance, actor network theory or more sociological perspectives on learning as being more, or social technical perspective being more instrumental. And especially with the rise of digital technology and with the rise of generative AI now, like this hybridization that you were referring to, Rola, is very important to try to understand using tools that are appropriate, such as social technical perspectives are I think they're more appropriate than a social cultural theory in this case.
You know, I just thought about it, but maybe I'm a bit slow on this, but if you think about, I was trying to think about how do we shift assessment to really assess a bigger unit of analysis. But actually, as you've been talking, I've been reflecting that maybe it's not about shifting the assessment to a broader unit of analysis, but simply recognizing that there's a broader unit of analysis affords a different form of engagement with the assessment. And maybe that itself is enough at the moment in terms of getting better engagement and more authentic engagement between people, between students and teachers, actually, rather than the assessment of the broader unit of analysis. I don't know if that makes sense.
I could not agree more. I think we have to start, and we've started already in many different ways. Probably we're labeling this type of approaches in different way, but we're doing the same thing. Starting at this simple level of acknowledging this complexity, and this is in essence my argument in the talk today. Acknowledge this complexity and try to understand it as is, and then try to capitalize on that research knowledge in the way we engage, both in how we design for learning and for assessment. I think that's the first important step to make if we haven't made it yet.
So here's the trickiness, right? When we think about assessing then at a larger scale, how do we scale up these techniques? And I know we've spoken about Gen AI potentially helping with analysis around, and you showed us some pictures of the dashboard and what it can capture in terms of processes. Do you have any other thoughts around maybe scaling up the collaborative process across more students, more contexts, that sort of thing?
I would guess, again, honest answer, this is something that I need to give more thought to, especially once we've concluded this project, which is giving us the opportunity, and learning from others, obviously, giving us the opportunity to apply different digital methods to process both data and to understand how this could be scaled up. I think one point at a more philosophical, almost existential level would be, and I know you've been working with this topics for a long period of time, is to force through the understanding in industry, in the broader context of the society, and within the institutional realm, that output is not the only thing that we can measure and we should measure. And I'm sure that this work has been going on for a long time. But I think it's important, because without that acknowledgement and understanding from those that would actually welcome graduates in work life, without understanding that the trajectory and how students arrive to this, output point, it's very hard to understand what the students can and will be able to develop in terms of future abilities. I think it's difficult to even engage in the process that you are suggesting. And institutionally, we need the type of institutional structures that allow us to actually engage with assessing processes and in a formative way. Because if we take the very simple example, and this is a personal reflection, we take the very simple example of generative AI. If the institutional structures in a university don't provide support, whether financial or competence, or simply the freedom to bring in those resources into the educational process and build them as organic elements of a learning design of a course, in order to use them as supportive tools for assessment, we will not be able to implement that, even if we have brilliant ideas about how to do it, and research has shown that would show that it's actually possible and beneficial. So I think, while this is a little on the perhaps a side comment to instead of an answer, I believe that without the institutional opening up to the array of possibilities and to the understanding that we need to engage with the process, I don't think we have a big chance to actually achieving
it. So that's a big, I think that's a big challenge really and opportunity really for the sector to engage with processes and with new technologies in more detail, but also to really reflect on how we design assessment and how we iterate that design, and what data we need to actually then continue to improve the assessment year on year, which is really important. I'm just conscious of time, and although we have a few more questions, maybe I'll end on one last question, which I think we've touched on a little bit, but I think is fundamental to the whole conversation. So it might be worth reiterating. And that's the top question there. Do you think it makes epistemological sense to try to identify individual students' contributions to collaborative work? Or is there no such thing because all work is distributed?
This is a very, very interesting and challenging question. I guess it depends on the premises on which we operate. If we are researchers on the research problem we are trying to understand, it's whether we are interested in individual behavior in the context of a collaborative process or collaborative activity, that would then it would absolutely make sense to try to track individual participation and contributions and experiences. But if we're interested in how individuals are being part of a joint effort, for instance, engage in this shared problem space that I've been referring to, and they bring in individual ideas that could be merged together or could lead to a joint answer to a particular problem or a solution. I would say that understanding how this interactional process helps students both learn from this combination of individual contributions, and also how that process emerges as an interactional effort is more important, rather than identifying what student 1 and student X and student Y does. From the perspective of practice, from a teacher's perspective, I know, and we all know, that it's very important to know how students are doing during a collaborative work, in order to perhaps assist them or provide guidance. And in this, I think this is where this project TeamLearn that I've been providing examples from comes in. It's exactly what we hope to be able to identify, not only to support students, data-driven reflection by students, but also to give the teachers an understanding of how each student in the group that they are working with are positioning themselves in that collaboration, both by observing them and seeing what happens to the data, but also seeing them how they react in the reflection session. So that can offer the teachers a basis for identifying students at risk, students that are not comfortable in the collaborative context, or students who simply don't engage or don't perform the task. I know that there is a need of scaling up here as well, so this is perhaps a discussion for another time.
Thank you so much, Crina. I've gotten so much out of this, just reflecting on the intricacies of practice and what we need to really think about in terms of perhaps bringing in a bit more complexity, I think, into the assessment design, into the affordances that we create for students, into the way we invite them into an assessment, into the need for iteration and buy-in and really careful thought about the sorts of data that we need to assure learning, but also to prompt further learning. And I really look forward to seeing where you land with this project, because and the program of work, really, because I think there's so much value in thinking about collaborative practice as part of what we do in the world. So thank you so much, and for really trying to think about it from an assessment perspective as well, which I know, when we spoke about it, you're coming at it from a researcher, but trying to think about the transferability to an assessment world. And so, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us for your thoughts. We've saved the chat, and we'll share that with you in order to, to capture all those references that people were kindly sharing and that Crina has shared. I'm sure she'd be very happy to answer specific questions after this as well, if you want to email her. And just a final plug, please join us Monday, 3 p.m. We'll be looking at how we can strengthen relationships between authenticity, assessment, and future practice. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.